Good afternoon, Houston program. My name is Ashley Adams. I'm the PGY2 Administration Resident at the DeBakey VA Medical Center, and we'll be continuing our sustainability portion of project management. I'll be following up what Dr. Stokes talked about last week in regards to traditional sustainability, but I'm doing it in a new direction. So now you've completed your project, you've hit multiple outcomes. You're in that middle portion, which gets a little messy. So how do you know how far you should let this project go before you should pull the plug? So there's two main reasons why we continue projects or we continue to pursue them. First, we're not rational. Second, we get caught in quicksand. So with rationality, if you're a project manager, you're going to have a lot at stake in regards to the project that you're currently working on. And with being at stake in regards to that project, it can cause you to have biases as well as other factors that could influence your decision making in regards to whether or not a project should continue. So it's really important as we go through some of these things that we should consider that rationality be one of them that we highlight. The other thing is quicksand. So sometimes maybe if you're going in and you're inexperienced, or this might be the first big project that you're involved in, you might get in and you might be a little bit over your head. So you go into the project, you've worked on it, and then you just get sunk deeper, deeper, and deeper as the project goes, and then at some points you may not be able to get out. So with these considerations, we're going to move to some of the things you should consider when you're debating about whether or not you should continue a project or whether or not you should withdraw. The first one is, does the project show future promise? So in the initial stages, it may seem promising that, I'm going to implement this clinical service, I'll implement this quality improvement project. You get outcomes preliminary that show benefit, but then over time, those outcomes may change. And the future of that project might change as well as you're getting multiple outcomes along the way. So that's something that you should look at, is always evaluating the future of where this project is going. Also, are the costs worth it if you abandon early? So some costs, such as like automation, you may purchase upfront, maybe extremely expensive. Once you've purchased that equipment and you begin implementing it, there may be things unforeseen that you didn't calculate when you're implementing it. For example, at the VA, technical issues in regards to like interfacing equipment. So that's something that we've already purchased it, we really can't abandon because we've already made that initial investment. Reinforcement psychology on managerial decisions. So as residents, we usually go through and we are looking for that reinforcement, that positive reinforcement to show that what we're doing well and that we can improve as we go along the way. Some of us may have experiences where we started a project, we learned something that dictated that we should quit the project, and then we take that experience onto our next one. Other of us may have been extremely successful. So some residents, every time they get into a project, it's success, success after success. But then once you get into that project where more than likely it will fail, you still believe that it's going to be a success because that's your past track record. So that's something really to look at, especially when you're considering putting people in managerial positions for projects. Look at their track record, see what decisions they've made, and that can also be something that you should monitor, whether or not you should assess them more at time checks rather than just leaving them on their own. Confirmation bias. So as we get data, sometimes we might skew that data to see what we want. And that's something as a project manager, especially if your job is at stake, that's something that you might tend to do. And as compared to someone, if they're just in that role, just doing it for like a pilot project where they still have other roles within the organization that they would still be a part of. And then self-justification to avoid personal failure. So if you're working on a major project, it's your institution, you're the project manager, you're the ones leading all the meetings, you're the headliner. If you come into a project that fails, you're the one who's going to take the hit. And sometimes that can be difficult to accept, so it's better just to continue the project even though it may seem like a futile effort. This ties in with social pressures. So within your community, especially if you're a manager, if you're rolling out a new technology or service, that's going to be something that could build your name in the organization or it could destroy your name. And you'll have social pressures that can also influence you in regards to continuing that project moving forward. Fate being tied to the project outcome is also something. And then there's this notion that in regards to strong leadership, persistence is associated with strong leadership. So those individuals with strong leadership tendencies, they say they can go through thick and thin. If they have all these difficulties, they can overcome them. But persistence doesn't necessarily associate with strong leadership. Sometimes strong leadership comes from identifying those projects that are seen in failures and backing out early instead of continuing through and then getting hit with a big loss at the end. It may be easy to not rock the boat, so just keeping things as they are. And sometimes administration is one of the causes of that. So administration, they tend to be slow moving depending on where you work, public versus private sector. So some people just want to continue the way because they don't want to go through the problems or just the effort in regards to implementing a new service and everything that would come with it. Finally, it's really important when you implement projects, is the decision going to affect the brand of the organization? So for example, I always remember ketchup. So ketchup, Heinz, they did this weird thing where they explored different colors of ketchup. So that was their project that they wanted to explore, but their whole brand is just delivering quality ketchup. The color was something that they were testing to see if maybe they could recruit more people, and it turned out to be a huge failure. So going into different colors, they still had their brand of ketchup, but it wasn't a viable option that consumers actually wanted to consume. So there's some ways that you can use this in order to identify overcommitment, especially in the project managers that you may have in these positions. So one is just back off. So make sure you schedule reflective sessions where you look at the status of the project and identify your decision circles, and making sure that these decision circles have people who have a stake in the project but also don't have a stake in the project. That way they can look at it objectively, and then you have that rationality that's included. Turning over administrators is another way of looking at it. So in administration, managers usually turn over. At least in my experience, I've seen many managers at the VA. Some of you have maybe more stable administration. So just through turnover administrators, that also can assess the project, because you have a new person coming in, looking at it objectively and seeing whether or not it's viable to move forward. Separating decision makers, reducing the risk of failure. So it's really important that you tell this project manager up front that if this project does fail, your fate's not tied with it. Sometimes that might not be the case, especially if you have a grant and that grant funded your position. Right now in the VA, we have the Office of Rural Health funding community ambulatory care pharmacists in the rural setting to increase access to veteran care. Those positions aren't guaranteed though. Right now they're just guaranteed for 3 years until they prove the project was successful, and then maybe it would expand further. So identifying that early on would be important as well. Improving the information system so that the data is released real time, and that way maybe you're not only relying on the project manager to provide you data. And then boosting experimentation through peripheral projects. So some businesses, what they do is they operate on a zero-based budget, but they'll have one line item that's focused just on experimentation. So if they want to test out a new product or a new project, they'll have it in that area. So it's reassessed yearly, and then if it's working, maybe they may move it into the budget continually year for year. But this is a way of getting rid of projects that aren't seen as benefiting the brand or benefiting the organization and providing a return on investment. So what I'd like for you to do is take out a piece of paper, or you can do it mentally, up to you. And we're going to go through 5 questions. And these 5 questions are really going to focus on if you've been overcommitted to a project. So think about a project that you've worked on extensively. For some of us PGY2s, it might be our thesis project, which we can't wait to be over with. Or for the PGY1s, it might be a thesis project that you're about to adventure on over the next year. And keep track of the tally, specifically the yeses. So question 1, do I have trouble defining what would constitute failure for this project or decision? Is my definition of failure ambiguous, or does it shift as the project evolves? So these are all yes or no answers. Question 2, would failure on this project radically change the way I think of myself as a manager or as a person? Have I bet the ranch on this venture for my career or for my own satisfaction? Question 3. Do I have trouble hearing other people's concerns about the project, and do I sometimes evaluate others' competence on the basis of their support for the project? Question 4. Do I generally evaluate how various events and actions will affect the project before I think about how they'll affect other areas of the organization or the company as a whole? And the last question is, do I sometimes feel that if this project ends, there will be no tomorrow? So based on that exercise, if you're answering yes to some of these questions, you may be poised for overcommitment. So recognizing this is the first step, especially as many of us will be going into management positions. This may be something just to keep in mind, especially when you're working with your other team members. So while researching this topic, I stumbled across Rosabeth Moss Cantor, who is a professor at Harvard, and she's also the chair and director of their Advanced Leadership Institute. She's done a lot of writings on change management, and she developed this law. Everything looks like a failure in the middle. Everyone loves inspiring beginnings and happy endings. It is just the middles that involve the hard work. And really, when you go into project sustainability, you may have had that happy ending, but now you're going into a whole new area where you have to sustain it and continue it moving forward. So in her article, Change is Hardest in the Middle, she offered some ideas on how to assess this. And the first one is tuning into the environment. So what has changed since you began the initiative? Do the original assumptions hold? Is the need still there? So over time, a lot of our projects will take years to implement. So at the beginning, it may seem like a good idea, but maybe at year 2, it's not the same. That would be an idea of figuring out whether or not we should persist or pull the plug. Checking the vision. Does the idea still feel inspiring? Is it big enough to make extra efforts worthwhile? So for me, in regards to my thesis project, I was really passionate about ambulatory care and the VA and just clinical practice in that setting. So for me to have the opportunity to work with the Center of Excellence in Primary Care Education, that was a vision that aligned with my goals and what I wanted to do. And for me, having to do all the extra steps to work with all these other people on this project, I was willing to put in that time and effort to make it worthwhile. So for me, I knew that I needed to continue that project even though I knew I'd have a lot of road bumps. Testing the support. So you do still have supporters that are enthusiastic about the mission, and then will you have the ability to gain new partners and stakeholders? Because that's also really important. Like I mentioned before, there's a lot of turnover in regards to organizations, so being able to recruit new individuals, like for the upcoming class, new residents will be coming in. So if you have a project, you need some help, you want to have someone who would be enthusiastic to work with you. Examining progress. So really looking at the milestones, any demonstrations or indicators that show that this project might have success long term, and then are they sustainable, and can you silence the critics? With any project, you're going to have a lot of critics who are not going to be against it, or who will be against it or not in support. Initially, you may be able to prove them wrong, but over time, once they see that it starts to fail, or if it just goes in the background, they may, again, just revisit that situation and say that it might be something that needs to be axed. Another thing is just searching for synergy. So can the project work well with other activities, and then it can be enhanced by alliances. So we have a lot of alliances within the medical center. So working together on projects is one way to develop a synergy where you might have a project that you would want to persist moving forward. In another article, Cantor explores 12 guidelines that you really should ask and evaluate when you're doing project management, especially if the time has come. You see it's coming, but sometimes you don't want to pull the plug, but you know that for the best for the organization, this is what you need to do. And the first is, are the initial reasons still valid? Is there any external changes? So sometimes we might implement a project, but then let's say a new law has been passed or a new policy, which makes this project really useless. That would be one thing that you would evaluate. Do the needs for which the solution remain unmet, or are competing solutions still unproven or adequate? So while you're developing research, for example, you might think you have the best drug for this indication, but then another company has beaten you to it. Is it still worth it to pursue that medication even though you can't beat the competitor? Would the situation get worse if this effort stopped? And this really comes to just money that's involved in the project. So sometimes you reach a point of no return, especially like in infrastructure projects. So in infrastructure, you may have $300 million dedicated to building this new bridge or road, and then you're halfway through the project and you realize you need $300 million more. But by pulling out, you would waste $300 million instead of just doing the extra infrastructure and finishing out. This ties into, is it more cost effective to continue than to pay the cost of restarting? Is a vision attracting others? So are you able to, once you've sustained it, are you able to still recruit people to still be involved and that want to be involved? And then as leaders, are you still enthusiastic, committed, and focused on the effort? The final 6 really focus just on motivation and resources. So are the resources still available? Is the skepticism and resistance declining? And then as working as a team, are you still motivated to continue? And this would be something as new people come into this team or exit the team, this would probably something that would need to be evaluated consistently. Have you met those critical deadlines and milestones? Any signs of progress? That you've solved problems or are the trends positive? And then is there a concrete achievement? And this really comes down to the research and publication. So when you're going through these projects, you've noticed that you've done something novel and you've accomplished something, making sure that you publish it for others. So that could be a way of an expansion, and it also can get you kind of your niche area where you become an expert. And finally, I found this quote, which I think is very amusing. So, success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss in enthusiasm. So even though you have that project, you realize it's time to pull the plug and you feel defeated, if you still maintain your enthusiasm moving forward, good things will attract you, and hopefully you'll get that next project that's an amazing success. These are my references, mostly from HBR and mainly from Rosabeth Moss-Cantor from Harvard, and I'll take any questions.
Sure.